Over 1,200 years before the birth of Christ, two great civilizations dominated the Near East. The powerful Egyptian Empire, and to the north, the Hittite Empire. For generations, both these mighty kingdoms had been struggling for control of a narrow strip of land linking Asia, Europe, and Africa. Situated in modern-day Syria, this crucial gateway, known at the time as Amurru, was the key to power in the Near East. But by 1288 BC, tensions had reached boiling point. It was the defining moment of the reign of Ramesses the Great, and it turned the young and inexperienced pharaoh into a living legend. The bloody showdown erupted at Cadesh, an epic fight that was decided by skill, speed, deception, and the vagaries of fortune, during which even the rulers found themselves in the line of fire.
The empires of Egypt and of Hittite were clashing for the reasons that empires always clash: power. The city of Cadesh, situated at the eastern end of the Eleutheris Valley, was the gateway to northern Syria. Control of Syria, its natural resources and trade routes equated to control of the ancient world.
Long ago, the Egyptians had conquered Cadesh and Amurru, a state next to it, and Seti I had a war with the Hittites first, that is Ramesses' father, and he actually got Cadesh and Amurru, but then he came to an agreement with the Hittite king saying, okay, we better make peace because it's making wars expensive. Now his young son Ramesses II was very ambitious and obviously did not hold with this solution.
If the Egyptians wish to break out into central Syria, then they have to have control of Cadesh. If the Hittites want to prevent the Egyptians from doing this, they have to have Cadesh.
The road to Cadesh stretched back to a time of relative peace between the Egyptians, Hittites, and a third power, the Mitannians of Mitanni, who were based in parts of modern-day Turkey and Iraq. A treaty between Egypt and the Mitannians divided the contested region of Amurru according to where each empire's commercial interests were based. After the partition, Egyptian interests stretched as far as the northern coastal settlement at Ugarit. However, political developments in Amurru began to threaten the fragile balance of power. An independence movement gained momentum, prompting the Mitannians to intervene and to eventually occupy the city of Cadesh. It was not to be the last time the city changed hands.
The Egyptians and the Hittites were the two superpowers of their day. Egypt controlled most of the southern part of the area we call Syria and Palestine. The Hittites wanted the northern part, and there had been a long seesawing conflict between them over the last 3 or 4 generations.
The city of Cadesh sits in a strategically vital location at the eastern end of the Eleutheris Valley. Possession of the Eleutheris Valley equated to easy access to northern Syria, and northern Syria, with its vast natural wealth and trade routes, equated to power, control of the ancient world.
Strategic importance is impossible to overrate, and indeed, if you look at the history of the Crusades, for example, or the activities of the British General Allenby during the First World War, you'll find that the same strategic imperatives operate at those periods also.
A large tactical game was being played out in Amurru, and the Hittites were about to establish their stranglehold on the area. By around 1380 BC, Cadesh was under Hittite control.
The Hittites are really rather a fascinating people. The heartland of the Hittite Empire lay in what we now call Turkey, specifically in Anatolia, and the Hittites as such appear in that area very roughly about 2000 BC.
They moved into Syria, they demolished one of the kingdoms which was allied to Egypt, Mitanni, and they came right up to Cadesh and they took it at the time of Akhenaten, the famous Sun King, who wasn't interested in war. So Egypt lost it 70 years before Ramesses.
And at the time that the conflict took place between Ramesses II and the Hittites, we're very much at the high summer of the development of the Hittite Empire.
Over the years, Hittite power ebbed and flowed, with the empire's army suffering terribly at the hands of both the Egyptians and the Mitannians. Eventually, by 1380 BC, the Hittites managed to defeat the Mitannians and embarked on a long period of rivalry with the Egyptians, spreading their influence to the Aegean, Armenia, and Upper Mesopotamia. It was this expansion that brought the Hittites, under their king Muwatallish, into direct conflict with the Egyptians. A conflict that would reach a bloody climax at Cadesh.
Cadesh was the natural crossroads of this conflict. It lay across the east-west passage that gets you from the coast of the Mediterranean into the Syrian desert, and it also lay on the river Orontes, which goes north-south and is the basic waterfare of that part of the world. Cadesh, therefore, was the point where armies tended to meet.
The Hittites had had their eyes on the area around Cadesh for some time. The Egyptians, under the expansionist pharaohs Seti I and Ramses II, were looking to extend their empire up to and beyond Amurru. Seti I had enjoyed some short-term success, and Ramesses decided to rekindle the conflict by leading his army north via Gaza, past Damascus, towards the city of Cadesh. Ramesses' aim was simple. It was to crush the Hittite forces and remove their influence in Syria.
He was completely confident about everything he was doing. Nothing had gone wrong. In 5 years as a young pharaoh, at the age of 25 to 30, when you're young, you're ambitious, nothing can go wrong.
Ramses is described on his own tomb as a youthful lord, a hero without peer. He came to the throne at the age probably of 25, certainly not much later than 30, and he came to the throne full of the vigour of youth, intent on regaining Egypt's lost possessions in northern Syria.
He was completely ebullient and ambustious, being compared with Muhammad Ali in his early days, the famous boxer. If there's something he's interested in, he will go for it. He had immense ambition. He and his father and his dynasty had to follow the magnificent 18th dynasty that had just built all the biggest temples there were in Egypt, and they had to follow that.
Before he came to the throne, he was very active in his father's reign. In the first couple of years of the reign of Seti I, he was active in Libya and also in Seti's campaign against Amurru and against Cadesh, where both Amurru and Cadesh were actually taken by Seti I. And Seti had to give it up, but nevertheless he had first-hand experience of campaigning in that area. And then later, but still in the reign of Seti I, we find Ramesses II campaigning on his own in a small military operation in Nubia, which was successful. And then, of course, before the campaign of Regnum V in his own reign, he had been operating in Amurru, so he'd been able to consolidate his knowledge of the area and build up his experience of the area. So we're not dealing with a tyro. This man knew about war, and he knew about the theatre of operations.
The Hittite army was far more heterogeneous than its Egyptian counterpart. The army that clashed with the Egyptians at Cadesh was a melting pot of Hittites from every corner of the empire. It was comprised of no less than 18 separate Hittite allies and vassals, making efficient command and control extremely difficult.
The Hittites had to communicate in various levels, using various languages and using various interpreters. That made their movements much more complicated than the Egyptians.
The Hittite army was very much the cream of the cream. It was very well trained. Its chariot force was extremely efficient. Its military equipment was extremely good. Their tactical expertise was very great. They were experts at siege warfare.
The Hittites were the great metal workers of their day. They had access in Turkey, Anatolia, to sources of metal which the Egyptians simply did not have. The Egyptians had to import metal and import technology to go along with it. The Hittites were therefore at an advantage in a straight fight. What they lacked was maneuverability. They tended to work in a sledgehammer scheme, coming down and using force in order to assert their will over the battlefield. The Egyptians, on the other hand, were more lightweight but much more maneuverable. They could move quickly, take advantage of surprise, and could communicate from one part of their army much more easily than the Hittites could.
Most Hittite soldiers were not paid for their services and were fighting to fulfill feudal obligations to their monarch. But for many Hittite soldiers, the lure of the army was primarily down to the prospect of plundered riches in battle.
They were not paid salaries, they were not paid regular maintenance, but they were expected on the battlefield to get prizes, booty, and loot.
But the love of the spoils of war was also the Hittites' Achilles' heel, and it would later prove to be their undoing. To add to the melting pot, the Hittites relied extensively on mercenary troops to swell their ranks. However, King Muwatallish had fought several successful campaigns before Cadesh, and the veterans of wars in Anatolia formed the core of his forces, providing valuable battlefield experience and leadership.
Discover the past with exclusive ancient history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians from History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to explore everything from the wonders of Pompeii to the rebellion of Boudica and the mysteries of prehistoric Scotland. Immerse yourself in the captivating stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
The Egyptians who opposed the Hittites were organized very differently. The Egyptian army was an elite organization, separate from the wider mass of the Egyptian population. An idea of inherent superiority was carefully nurtured within the army, and its members came to regard themselves as an exclusive elite, distinct and superior to the ordinary people.
In Egypt, the Ramesside family itself, Ramesses was of a military family, and generals and military were therefore an important element in the Egyptian government and court makeup. There are plenty of civilian administrators, but the army was very important. Below the official level of generals and so on, you got the well-educated level for the administration, scribal training and so on. The ordinary Egyptian peasantry would be conscripted for when they were needed, trained in infantry, but chariotry was an elite corps.
The Egyptian army was largely composed of Egyptians, although there were some mercenaries from Nubia and from Libya as well, but it was a much more coherent army than the Hittite one.
They had large infantry divisions and then chariot corps alongside them. An Egyptian infantry division might be 4,000 or 5,000 men, the chariots 500 chariots. So Ramesses could have taken 20,000 people to Cadesh or 14,000 people to Cadesh. Muwatallish is certainly supposed to have taken 36,000 according to the figures that Ramesses gives, so 17 and 18,000 people, something like that is quoted. We can't prove the figures, but they could raise quite big armies in those days.
Considerable emphasis was laid on duration of service, and a corps of long-serving professionals was central to its effectiveness. The Egyptian army was separated into 4 separate corps. Ammon, Pre, Ptah, and Sutek were all named after Egyptian gods. The corps deployed at Cadesh were drawn from different regions of the Egyptian empire. Ramesses commanded the corps of Ammon, named after the god of Thebes. Pre was named after the sun god of Heliopolis. Sutek after the great storm god, loved by Ramesses' family, and Ptah after the local god of Memphis. These various corps consisted mainly of chariot crews and infantry, with an archery contingent, totaling about 5,000 men, of whom 4,000 were infantrymen. The remainder manned the 500 chariots. The epic poem that chronicles the battle claims that Ramesses had at his disposal around 2,000 chariots and 16,000 infantry, a smaller number than the Hittite force. However, as Ramesses himself commissioned the poem, this vast outnumbering of his army by the Hittite army may well be an exaggeration. There were also great differences between the weapons used by the Egyptian and Hittite infantry. Hittite infantrymen generally went into action armed with a bronze, sickle-shaped sword, and were often equipped with bronze helmets and scale armor. Some also carried longer spears for dealing with cavalry or chariots. The Egyptian infantry carried versions of the sickle-type sword called a khopesh, as well as a bronze-headed axe and a thrusting dagger. They also made extensive use of a composite bow, a weapon also carried by the chariot crews, which was devastatingly effective at short range, and which, in the hands of a skilled archer, could also be a fearsome killing machine over longer distances. The Battle of Cadesh was fought on the 9th day of the 3rd month of the 5th year of the reign of Ramesses II, which places it in late May 1288 BC. Ramesses, leading the corps of Amun, had taken about a month to make the journey from Egypt to reach the vicinity of Cadesh. He travelled through Canaan and what was then known as the Valley of the Conifers, the present-day Bekaa Valley, before pausing at a town that bore his name, Ramesses. Moving north, Ramesses camped at the ridge of Cadesh, 15 miles south of Cadesh city. From here, the next morning, Pharaoh moved north to cross the river Orontes, known now as the Nahr el-Assi, and headed towards the city of Cadesh. At this point, the Pharaoh came across 2 Hittite agents, claiming to be deserters. These men persuaded him that the main body of the Hittite army was 100 miles away at Aleppo, far from where they actually were. Crucially, as with most successful deception plans, the information did not try to persuade the Egyptians of something wholly different to what they already believed. And Ramesses was convinced.
He was far too complacent. He thought he knew best. He was young, brash, a little naive, and ambitious. He just plunged ahead. He wasn't as cautious. He wasn't seasoned like Muwatlits, who'd been in this job 20 or 30 years.
Almost certainly, Ramesses concluded that he had gained the initiative in the battle, and almost certainly his guard was relaxed.
But of course, the real issue here is what had happened to Ramesses II's own intelligence gathering operation. He was very much in bandit country, and this is enemy territory, and there should have been a screen of scouts out in front of the army looking for the Hittites. Nothing like that was clearly taking place. And one can only, I think, come to the view that the actions of Ramesses II and his commanders at this point were reckless.
In response to this information, Ramesses sought to take the initiative by attacking the city of Cadesh. Believing that the forces in the city were effectively cut off from the larger body of the Hittite army, Ramesses' corps of Amun forded the Orontes River and reached Cadesh in good order, setting up a fortified position to the northwest of the city. This position effectively commanded the road that led from the city to the north. The 2 Hittite spies, having been released by Ramesses, returned to the Hittite camp and passed on the news of Ramesses' actions. It was an Egyptian trap, so Ramesses thought, that was being set.
This was what Ramesses wanted to believe. He thought that he'd move quicker and much more intelligently than the Hittites. He was about to have a rude shock.
It was Egyptian soldiers conducting routine scouting operations who captured 2 Hittite soldiers who had a different tale to tell. After vigorous interrogation, they told the increasingly concerned Pharaoh that the main Hittite army was not many miles away, but in fact stood ready to the northeast of Cadesh, barely 2.5 miles due east, and was more numerous than the sand of the riverbank. The implications of this new intelligence for the Pharaoh and his forces were very grim indeed.
Muwatallish, I think, played his cards very well. We have to take the view that he and his high command had achieved a brilliant tactical success in getting their forces to within easy striking distance of the Egyptians and masking their position behind the city of Cadesh. This is the kind of tactical brilliance one would expect of the Hittites.
Ramesses was now potentially in serious trouble. Only his corps, the Amun, had so far reached Cadesh. With his army divided, the initiative lay with the Hittites, should they choose to capitalize on the position. But the events of the following day perhaps suggest that King Muwatallish was simply unaware of the strength of his own position. Ramesses acted decisively and planned to send his chief minister to hurry up the following Egyptian forces. At this juncture, the other elements of Ramesses' army were spread out to the south. The corps of prey was just crossing the river Orontes, around 6.5 miles south of the Pharaoh's position. The other two corps were further south still, with Ptah still emerging from the extensive wooded area at Labwe. The corps of prey had crossed the fords by about 2:30 p.m. and by 3 p.m. was spread out across the plain of Cadesh, with the city visible in the distance. As the corps moved towards its destination, it was suddenly attacked by a strong force of Hittite chariots. Pharaoh's chief minister, having witnessed the attack of the Hittites on prey, made all haste to reach the corps of Ptah, leaving the Pharaoh's camp at around 3:30 p.m.
Here we have a superb example of the tactical expertise of the Hittites. They've achieved total tactical surprise, and the effect would have been mind-numbing.
Hittite chariots exploded forth from a screen of vegetation along the Al-Makadiah River, a tributary of the Orontes. The Egyptian corps of prey, moving steadily north, had little or no warning of the impending attack, and indeed the screening force of Egyptian chariots was overwhelmed almost instantaneously by the ferocity and speed of the Hittite advance.
The much heavier Hittite chariots smashed through them, mowing down their crews as they were swept aside. Picking up momentum all the time, the Hittite chariots then hurtled towards the marching Egyptian infantry, smashing into the flank of the Egyptian formations. Such was the ferocity of the assault that the Hittite forces broke through the Egyptian columns and emerged on the western side. The heavy Hittite chariots, though, were unable to turn quickly, and so they had to continue westward in order to make a wide turn. By doing this, they ended up running parallel with the Egyptian army, giving them the opportunity to accelerate their progress towards Ramesses' camp.
The Hittites had heavy-grade weaponry, heavy-grade swords, heavy-grade bows, and above all, great chariots that could smash their way through a battle line. In a direct struggle of power against power, the Hittites would probably win. But the Egyptians, with their maneuverability and their flexibility, could put up a pretty good fight as well.
The Hittites favoured a far larger 3-man chariot with a driver, a shield bearer, and an armoured spear carrier. The Egyptians, by contrast, favoured a 2-man chariot, a driver and a spear carrier, also equipped with a bow. The Egyptian chariots were far lighter and, by modern standards, looked comparatively fragile. However, their lightweight design was very robust and extremely manoeuvrable.
The two lines of opposing troops arrived almost simultaneously, with the prey survivors just in front. Watching from within the Pharaoh's encampment, the corps of Amun slowly began to make sense of the confusing battle that was unfolding before them, and they prepared to meet the rapidly closing Hittite forces that were now intent on hitting the Egyptian camp at its western edge. With the Amun soldiers poised for action, the Hittite chariot struck the Pharaoh's camp at breakneck speed, causing terrible Egyptian casualties. But the momentum of the Hittite chariots was slowed by the baggage within the camp, allowing the Egyptians to attack the chariot crews. Soon, the piles of dead men and horses slowed the Hittites even further, and the Egyptians sensed the tide of battle was turning in their favor.
Survivors of the prey division and their Hittite pursuers reached Pharaoh's camp almost simultaneously. It took a while for the men of Ammon, the division at the encampment, to realize what had happened and for a defense to be mustered. Members of Pharaoh's family were moved to the eastern end of the camp, away from the main danger, and Pharaoh's bodyguards and other infantry began repelling the Hittite chariots.
There were more problems in store for the Hittites. No doubt taken aback by the fabulous wealth on display within the Pharaoh's camp, Hittite soldiers started to forget the task at hand as their thoughts turned to plunder and looting.
The Hittites got into the Egyptian camp, broke in, and realised, of course, that there was the booty of the richest superpower on earth. Gold in profusion was something that Pharaoh had, and the people of the Near East knew this. The temptation to plunder the camp was irresistible. That gave the Egyptians a great advantage. The column of tar was fresh. It could concentrate on the situation without being distracted. It was able to keep up firepower on the Hittites.
They are trapped inside the camp, and the Egyptians set about systematically butchering them. There are scenes, in fact, surviving of the Egyptian troops putting all these to the sword, and the text says that not one of them escaped. Now, Egyptian texts are not renowned for their modesty, but I find it entirely plausible that any Hittite who got inside this square enclosure didn't get out alive.
The course of the battle hung precariously in the balance, and, spotting a vital opportunity, Ramesses seized the moment.
Even at this stage, despite the fact that the momentum of the Hittite attack had been impeded, the outlook for the core of Ammon did not look particularly good. A dramatic change in the course of events was required.
When you found the enemy pouring into your camp, mayhem everywhere, and they were going for you, he had one choice. He had to fight or die on the spot. He called his equerries, he called his immediate people around and said, look, grab your weapons, we're going. It was do or die, and Ramesses chose to do, whether he died or not.
Despite the shock of the Hittite attack and the confusion of battle, the young pharaoh began to lead in a manner befitting a king, and in doing so established the legend that has lasted until this day.
The problem about what Ramesses does is that we've only got his account, and you're dealing with one of the big egos. According to Ramesses' account, he realizes that things are desperate. There are no reinforcements, he's on his own with his trusty chariot and charioteer. He sends up a prayer to the Egyptian god of war, turns round and single-handed scatters the Hittite army from the field. The reality is likely to have been a bit different.
Ramesses II was not on his own. That is absolutely inconceivable. And from time to time, the text does admit that he did get assistance. I think what we have is an extremely brave man in a situation which he probably saw as being almost impossible. And you have something which John Keegan has described as flight to the front. You simply rush at the enemy, there's nothing else to do, and you keep rushing at the enemy in the hope that this will have a positive effect.
He had brute courage. I think we have to grant him that. He thought, right, if I'm going to die, at least I'm going to die as Pharaoh of Egypt should die, but I'm going to try and break out. This is an act of desperation.
And I think he almost certainly played an important role in arresting the momentum of the attacking force.
Climbing aboard his chariot, Ramesses barked a command to his driver Mena and led all the available Egyptian chariots out of the eastern part of Amun's encampment. This force swept around the camp in an arc towards the northwest and assembled in attacking order.
With modern battles, you've got modern communications, but they're not infallible. In the ancient world, you're relying on signals sent through the dust of battle. You're relying on conflicting reports coming in. You're trying to make very quick decisions based on confusing evidence. If the Hittite king had acted swiftly, he could actually have penned the Egyptians into their camp and finished them off. But he didn't, and bit by bit, the Egyptians were able to turn the entire battle around. The Hittites came within a whisker of a complete victory, and they lost it, probably through confused intelligence.
At this point, the battle really hung in the balance. The initial Hittite attack had been broken, but had not been defeated. Neither, however, were the Egyptians making much headway. It needed a dramatic turn of events to influence the outcome of the battle, and it is this that Ramses provided, firstly through inspirational leadership, and secondly through rounding up and taking what men he could to effect a dramatic counterattack on the Hittites and to destroy conclusively their ambitions of an overwhelming tactical success.
Suddenly the besieged had become the besieger, and despite the obvious danger that the Egyptians now posed to the Hittites, the army could do little to repel Ramesses and his men. The Hittites' attention was focused almost entirely on the fighting in the camp, where they fought Egyptian infantry and archers, whose fast and accurate fire was now taking a terrible toll on the static Hittites.
Ramses and a small contingent of the army put in a series of attacks on the Hittites, and that has the effect not of breaking them, but of slowing them down.
With the Hittites pinned down by missile fire, the Egyptian chariots had the opportunity to maneuver into position. Ramesses led his chariots towards the Hittite force that was engaged in fierce, close combat with the Egyptian infantry. The Pharaoh's chariot archers began to rain arrows down on their enemy, and the Hittites began slowly to escape and retreat in disarray, pursued by Ramesses at the head of the Egyptian force.
Ramesses was able to hold his troops together by an example of bravery. That alone wouldn't have made much difference, but the psychological factor and the arrival of the extra divisions of the Egyptian army was what made the day and was what turned it into an Egyptian victory rather than a complete rout.
Watching from his vantage point, time was rapidly running out for King Muwatallish. Decisive action would have to be taken now to spare the Hittite army from total annihilation.
The Hittite king is faced with several options. One is simply to get out. The other is to get out in such a way that it gives the impression that you're still the victor, and in the ancient Orient that counts.
There were scant forces remaining to effect any plan to rescue his fleeing army. The only readily deployable force was the king's own immediate entourage of high-ranking officials and nobles.
When he saw trouble, he had to take a decision. Wait and see what happens, or try and correct it. Ramesses obviously tried to correct. He sent the chariots across, the second force. In charge of that force were many of his close people, including a brother, the highest in the hierarchy, the military hierarchy, because when they all got driven back into the river and dragged out the other side, dead and alive, the Egyptians gave a list of the names of some of these noble people, and included the king's brother, one of his brothers. So it was a complete cut-off of a great many of the Hittite military hierarchy. That was a bigger disaster than what Ramesses suffered. He lost some people, but mainly ordinary charioteers. He didn't lose his chiefs of staff.
Driven on by blind loyalty to Muwatallish, the ill-prepared force began to cross the Orontes and move towards Pharaoh's camp to try and draw him back, thereby taking the pressure off the fleeing Hittite chariots. The plan seemed straightforward enough, but for the Hittites, more trouble was waiting around the corner. As the relief column of Hittite nobility surged at the Egyptian camp, they were met by yet another Egyptian formation that had arrived totally unexpectedly from the north. This was the Ne'erim, which had become detached from the main body of the Egyptian army, but which had turned up at a very opportune time.
I think there's enough in the relevant textual material to indicate that Ramses had sent this force to Amurru with the intention that it would come down the Eleutheros river valley to attack Cadesh from the west. And that, I think, is tactically good, and it's strategically good. This means that pressure would be exerted on the city of Cadesh from the west or northwest, and also from the south. But their appearance, exactly when they were needed on the field of battle, I'm certain was an amazing piece of good fortune.
If the Hittite king moved perhaps an hour earlier, that would have made all the difference. But the arrival of the noblemen of the Hittites corresponded with the arrival of the 4th division of the Egyptian army coming from the rear. That was simply too much for them to cope with. The extra chariots in the camp, under the pressure of the 4th division, simply added to the chaos and the inability of the Hittites to extricate themselves from what was rapidly becoming a mess.
These were troops who had not been engaged. Their morale had not been shaken by contact with the Hittite forces. And they were able to start, I think, with easy pickings. They were able to catch forces of the Hittites in the camp with their guard down. And I think they were critically important, therefore, in arresting the progress of the attacking Hittite chariotry. It was their arrival in the end that saved Ramses' bacon, I think.
The Netherine chariots launched volley after volley of deadly arrows against the slow-moving Hittite force, which wavered and eventually turned to flee across the river Orontes. But as they turned, they found themselves faced by Ramesses' corps, which was returning from the south, and now the unfortunate Hittites were caught between the two prongs of the Pharaoh's forces.
The Hittites realised that they'd been caught from both sides, with the 4th detachment in their rear and the reinforcements coming from the other side of the battlefield. They start to retreat, which turns into a flight straight into the river Orontes.
In their desperate attempt to escape, many drowned as they threw themselves into the river. Among the dead were important members of Hittite society and government, whose loss was acutely felt after the war.
There they are, cascading into the river, bit by bit trying to get over, and there's a wonderful scene of the brother of the king of the Hittites being hauled out of the river and held upside down to get the water out of his insides that he swallowed during the flight.
Even at this great distance, there is still confusion as to what happened after the battle. Contemporary written accounts note that fighting continued into the next day. However, there is some controversy over exactly who was fighting whom. Some historians have interpreted the details of the killing following the main battle as that of Egyptian slaying Egyptian, rather than Egyptian slaying Hittite. It's believed that Ramesses spent the day after the battle executing Amun and Prey deserters who had broken their oath of allegiance to the pharaoh.
In general, the Egyptians were not the most vicious people of the ancient world. Atrocities are very rarely recorded in Egyptian sources. It's possible in the heat of the battle that Ramesses did execute some prisoners and some survivors. That happens in many battles in many civilizations. But on the whole, it's not characteristic either of Ramesses or of the Egyptian army.
The suggestion has been put up that Ramesses executed his own troops afterwards. There's not one scrap of evidence for this. It's a classical concept from Greco-Roman times that's got nothing to do with Egypt. There's no evidence at all for that. It's based on a misinterpretation of the Egyptian text. He gave them a thoroughgoing telling off. There must have been red scarlet with the telling off they were given, but that was as far as it went. I suspect when they got home, heads rolled in terms of demotions in the intelligence department. The less intelligent officers went, I suspect. Some other people were promoted. But of course, they're discreet about that sort of thing.
Although Ramesses had achieved an impressive victory at Cadesh, his army had taken such a battering that he was forced to review his wider ambitions for the area. The truth was that after Cadesh, Ramesses lacked sufficient men and materials to invade northern Syria, even with the belated arrival of the two corps of Tar and Sutek. The city of Cadesh still remained in Hittite hands following the battle, and Ramesses was powerless to do anything about it. The Egyptians may have won the battle, but the Hittites were still controlling the war. The aim of the war and of the campaign had been to ensure that the city of Cadesh came back into the Egyptian fold and to destroy the Hittite positions in Syria. Neither of these aims had been achieved.
The immediate aftermath of the battle is that the Egyptians are holding the field and the Hittites are retreating, but retreating with honour.
Nobody gained. The immediate aftermath otherwise was a complete stalemate on the ground, and the Hittites may have lost out another way. Ramesses didn't win Cadesh. He won a victory on the day personally, but he didn't get Cadesh. He never occupied that city.
In terms of an assessment of who won the Battle of Cadesh, one would almost certainly say that the tactical victor is Ramesses. However, in terms of realising his wider strategic ambitions, even after success on the field of Cadesh, Ramesses is no closer to satisfying those goals.
On the second day, the Egyptians try to budge the Hittite force, and they don't succeed in this. And the Hittite king, Muwatallish, offers terms to the Egyptians. And one of the things I rather like about the Hittites is their realism. Clearly, from their point of view, they had won a great strategic victory. And by strategic, I mean that they have prevented Ramesses II from achieving his aims.
They then start to ask themselves, what happens next? They could go on doing this indefinitely, wearing out their resources, having one Cadesh after another, claiming victory on one side and then next year a victory for the other side. But a more intelligent solution is to look at what both the superpowers want out of the diplomatic scene and try and come to some form of lasting arrangement. And the interesting thing is that that's what they do. They go for the diplomatic solution rather than the military stalemate.
16 years after the momentous Battle of Cadesh, a peace treaty between the Egyptian and Hittite people was signed.
The Egyptians and the Hittites start to think about the situation. And bit by bit, they draw up the first surviving treaty that we have in any detail from the ancient world. They sit down, they start to say, this is what the two sides need out of the political situation. They start to negotiate an extradition clause between the two great powers that are dividing up the Near East. They negotiate treaties of alliance and defence. And most interesting of all, they negotiate an economic clause. If either empire falls into economic difficulties, the other side is going to send food aid to it to bail it out.
The treaty recognised the boundaries of influence between Egypt and the Hittite Empire and ushered in an unbroken 80 years of peace in the region. This peace only ended with the eventual demise of the Hittite Empire.
Syria basically went to the Hittites. Palestine and the coast of Lebanon went to the Egyptians. Increasingly, both empires were going to run into trouble. The Hittites ran into economic difficulties and problems of communications, and the Egyptians started to bankrupt their own state. Ramesses built so many temples, so many monuments to his glorious ego, that the crown, bit by bit, went bankrupt.
Everything he did on the grand scale. It's quite amazing. And the biggest tomb in Egypt is the one that's now being opened up in the Valley of the Kings. There's Tomb 7, Ramesses' own tomb, which rivals that of his father. Those two were the biggest tombs in the valley. Right opposite is this Tomb 5, which was thought to be an unfinished tomb. And it goes down, hall, corridors running off, more corridors running off, enough room to bury 50 princes. It's the biggest tomb in Egypt. They haven't finished digging it yet.
Ramesses made enormous political capital out of Cadesh, exaggerating his role in the battle to heroic proportions, with some accounts claiming that he alone was responsible for the defeat of the Hittites.
Almost certainly Ramesses' actions in the Battle of Cadesh are exaggerated. That is not to say, however, that they are not grounded firmly on a kernel of truth. From all available sources, it seems as though Ramesses' actions in the heat of battle were decisive, and to that extent his reputation as a brave and fierce leader is well deserved, I think.
There is no doubt at all that Ramesses II was one of the great Egyptian pharaohs. I would not describe him as the greatest military leader the Egyptians produced, but when one looks overall at his reign, it is a spectacularly successful reign. His military operations were in the main extremely successful, and if you look at foreign policy overall, Egypt is one of the two top powers, the superpowers if you like, of the Near East.
Cadesh provided the source material for the very first comprehensive battle chronicle and the first international treaty in recorded history. Cadesh was the battleground for a clash of the titans of the ancient world, a showcase of the technology and tactics that had evolved over the previous 3,000 years. It was a classic story of speed, surprise, deception, and confusion, demonstrating that although the tools of war have changed over the last 3,000 years, most of the rules that govern their use have not.